Good evening, everyone. How's everybody doing? Good. That was a strong, resounding. Yeah, that was good. Everybody's awake. I like it. Let me bring this up here. Yeah, yeah, I know. We're back to the regularly scheduled Florida weather program of baking your cookies outside. Yeah, thank you all for having me. I figured for tonight's chat, we could talk a little bit about forgiveness, because I think that's certainly a topic where we have all at some point in our lives been the ones to hurt someone, but also be the ones that have been hurt. Right, so I think it's certainly one of those topics that I think can apply to everyone, but also at various points in our lives. And the reason why I have it on there as a journey is because forgiveness rarely is something that's simple, rarely is something that we come to terms very quickly, depending on what that offense, depending on what that pain was, right? Sometimes it may be something where it takes time. It takes self-reflection. It takes pondering. It truly is a journey to get us to a point to where we can forgive. And so for tonight's talk, I figured we could talk a little bit about some resources and tools that we can use to help us along in that journey there. And so as far as resources for tonight's lecture, we'll talk through some passages that are in the Gospel according to Spiritism, in the Spiritist book, as well as in this book right here, the Book of Forgiving. If forgiveness is something that, is something that you're actively working towards, something you want to learn more about, you want to look into more resources, I highly, highly recommend this book. It was written by an archbishop from South Africa. And him and his daughter, actually, who's a priest, he passed away in 2021, but she's still alive and she continues to practice. But essentially what they did was back in South Africa, when they were dealing with apartheid, they put together this reconciliation committee where they essentially, during that time, there were a lot of folks being persecuted because of their race, segregation, and all of that. And essentially what they did was they put together this reconciliation committee to help those folks that had been dealing with the pain and the struggles, reconciliate and forgive and find ways to be able to heal and move forward with their lives. And what I find really cool about that book is at the end of every chapter, they have little reflection and like practicing, almost like a workbook. And so it's a nice way to be able to kind of reflect on all of the reading and start to think, okay, how does this apply to my daily life? What are some things that I can start doing? So highly, highly recommend that book if you have not read it. And so kind of the agenda for tonight's talk is we're going to talk a little bit about some of the obstacles that we may have to face when it comes to forgiveness, or things that folks kind of bring up, the different forms of forgiveness, right? So there's obviously, I need to forgive someone, I need to be forgiven, and then also the self-forgiveness piece there. We'll dive a little bit into reasons for why we recommend this to everybody out there, and then kind of wrap up with the full circle of the journey to forgiveness there. So to get us started, I'd love to hear from you all. What are some things that you hear when we're talking about forgiveness with people and people don't necessarily want to forgive? Like, what are some things that come to mind that people use as maybe excuses or armors when they say that they don't want to forgive? Is there anything that comes to mind?
The rumination.
Oh, the rumination, yes.
Because they say, I forgive it, and then I started to think about it, what's making me mad, and the rumination is,
I forgive them, but do you know what they did to me? And then they tell a story all over again. So yes.
I need to forgive every week.
Yeah, pretty much, right? Every week, because every time you bring it up, you're also bringing up all of those feelings and the whole, exactly. And we're going to see that in just a little bit here as well. Yeah, that's a good call out.
It's like people say, I forgive, but I don't forget.
Exactly.
Which is very
Yeah.
true.
That's a big one. So it's funny because that's actually the very first one that I have here, right? Which is sometimes that there's some of that misconception between forgiving is forgetting what happened. Now, there's a difference in like, I'll forgive, but I'll never forget in terms of I'm always going to hold that against them type of a thing. But the interesting thing, so there's a psychologist who also happens to be a spiritist called, his name is Josandro Klinji. And I love how he talks about the distinction between forgiveness and where forgetfulness really comes in, because, you know, when we think about everything that we go through in life, there's always a lesson that we take away from it, right? Whether the outcome was good or bad, there's something that we learn from it. And so if we talk about forgiveness in terms of forgetting what happened, we're also forgetting the lesson, right? So whatever the struggle, whatever the pain we went through ends up not really helping us in the long run. So when we talk about forgiveness, really, you know, we're not saying we're going to forget in the sense that we just won't even remember that it happened, because we do want to take that lesson, right? We do want to learn something from that. But it is forgetting in the sense that we're not going to ruminate. We're not going to have that thing come up each and every single time that we think about that person. And so he even goes as far as to say, well, when you forgive, it's not like all of a sudden you develop amnesia, right? Because if it's something, especially if it's something that we've struggled with and we're actively working through to try to forgive, right? It's a healing process. And so we won't necessarily forget all of a sudden what happened, but we will learn that lesson and we will leave behind those negative feelings to be able to move on. And we'll kind of talk about that in a little bit as well. Another one that we oftentimes hear is, if I forgive, I'm allowing the injustice to win, right? Or if I forgive, I'm agreeing with what happened. And that's not necessarily the case. Forgiving is, I am letting go of those negative feelings. I can still disagree with what happened, right? I'm not saying that what happened was the right thing, what that person did was the right thing, but I am simply separating those two things there. Another one that sometimes gets brought up too is, I can't forgive someone who has no regrets, right? Sometimes people go, well, I'll forgive them when they come and ask for forgiveness. But what we're going to talk about, so much of the forgiving process is really about us and our healing, our coming to peace, rather than whether someone feels regret or not. And then another one is, if I forgive, I need to reconcile with that individual. And sure, in a perfect world, when all of us here are not even incarnated on earth, because we have evolved to the extent where we can easily forgive with a blink of an eye, that will be the case. Right? Where we will be so evolved, we'll truly feel the love that Jesus has taught us, that forgiving will be so easy that we will reconcile immediately after. But we know that we're not there yet. So if we're not there, right, again, the forgiveness is that journey of healing for us. That journey of healing, to being able to move on, move past from those negative feelings there. And sometimes we won't be able to reconcile. But those things are not mutually exclusive. We can still forgive and not be at a point where we can reconcile, especially because in order for that to happen, all parties involved have to be willing to do that. And so we'll talk about that one as well. And I think probably my favorite, I've had two people say this before, when all of the other arguments failed, they said, well, Lucy, I am not Jesus. And I thought, oh boy, I can't really argue with that one. Yeah, sure. But if that's the bar that we're setting, right? Like if we're saying, I can't forgive because I am not Jesus, well, he has left us with all of the tools, with all of the resources, and we may not necessarily be able to forgive as easily, but that's the one excuse that, come on, right? Like we can do better than that there. Any other ones that come to mind that you don't see listed on here? Any other ones y'all want to add that you've heard when trying to get people to forgive? Jesus, I know, Jesus is the best. When I heard that one, I had to stop for a second, and I was like, I can't argue with that, but I do have other things we can talk about.
Well, Luciana,
Yeah.
If you can forgive and you don't need to reconcile, oh, I can say that I forgive and I just go on with my life. But what do I really need to feel to know that I forget, that I forgive?
That's a good question. So and we're going to see in just a little bit here, there's a chapter in the gospel, chapter 10, which is the chapter that talks about blessed are the afflicted, blessed are the merciful. And one of the things that the spirits call out is that there's really two types of forgiveness, right? There's the forgiveness of, I will tell that person that I forgave them, but it's really just coming from the mouth, versus there's the forgiveness that's coming from the heart that relieves me from what has continued to tether me to that person, right? And what I mean by that is when we think about things that have brought us pain or a feeling of the need to revenge, right? The things that we do ruminate on, those are usually things that have been so deep within us that they don't ever leave us, right? We may not even talk about it all the time, but it's always there in the back of our minds. And we're going to see the effect that has on our daily lives, because the reality is it doesn't impact just us. It impacts everybody around us. It impacts our family. It impacts every single one of our relationships, because we start to carry those negative feelings, right? And so even if it's something where perhaps that person or even we don't want to continue to have a relationship, the ability to forgive is what allows us to move past those negative feelings. It's where we make a conscious decision to say, you know what? I am giving that person the power to rule my life, because constantly I keep thinking about it. I am upset about it. In fact, there's scientific research that shows whenever something happens, the part in our brain that activates the pain, every time we think about that event again, that same part of the brain activates. So when we're reliving that moment over and over, we're continuing to release those toxins. We're letting our brain thinks, oh my gosh, that thing is happening again. I can't believe it's happening again, right? So and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the, positives that will come from even if that person doesn't want to reconcile with us, or we don't, because maybe we're at different points in our lives, right? I think there's the important piece here is, how do I get to a point where I can wish that person well, right? Because there's that too. Sometimes we'll hear folks say, well, I forgive them, but I never want to see them again. And, if something bad were to happen, I just wouldn't be upset. I know it's karma getting back to them. And that's not really forgiveness, right? Forgiveness is, I understand what happened. I forgive them. I understand, I can be compassionate towards that person. I can be kind. I wish them well, but I also recognize that we're at different points in our lives where I don't want to get hurt again, right? So that's kind of the distinction there. And so in this chapter here, some of the different sections that the spirits go into detail, it talks about some of the different passages, the majority of them in Matthew, which we're going to talk about here. But the biggest thing is, I think, this chapter really brings us back to how we oftentimes are so quick to look and judge and have an opinion about everyone around us, that we spend more time doing that as opposed to looking deep within us and being able to work through the challenges that we have, or the imperfections that we still need to atone. And so the opening of this chapter here, again, a quote from Matthew there, which is regarding the ability to reconcile, right? And Jesus said, "Be reconciled as quickly as possible with your adversary, while you're with him on the way, so that he does not hand you over to the judge, and so that the judge does not hand you over to the minister of justice, so that you may not be in prison. Verily I say to you that I'll not leave you there as long as you have not paid the last debt there." And we want to break this down and obviously think about the perspective of, where the Jews were at the time and the need to pay their debt, right? The fact that they would be handed to the Romans. But what if we kind of bring this back to today's kind of language, what we're saying here is, hey, try to solve that issue as quickly as possible. And if we bring that even closer to Spiritism, where we know that life doesn't end here, we don't have the excuse to say, well, I'm never going to see that person again, so I guess I don't have to worry about that, right? Well, Jesus is saying here, hey, let's just figure it out as quickly as possible. But to your point, right, it may not be something where we can reconcile in this lifetime, but that doesn't mean that we don't take the steps that we can to inch a little bit closer in that journey. Because there will come a time, maybe not in this life, maybe not in the next life, maybe 5 or 10 lives after, where we do have the ability of reconciling. But we've got to start taking the steps right now. And then the other piece that we see here, which is specific to not judging, there's a section on there that Jesus said, "Do not judge so that yourself might not be judged. For you will be judged according to your having judged others. And the same measure will be used on you that you have used on them." And this really speaks to, again, how quickly sometimes we might be to judging folks without taking a step back and noticing, where am I at as it relates to this? And what the spirits call out in this particular section too is they say, be light and be kind in the judgment of others, and in fact, hold yourself to a higher standard. And normally we tend to do the opposite. When we make a mistake, right, we go, it was something, I dropped the ball here, but if somebody else makes that same mistake, especially if it's somebody we struggle with, right, we're very quick to point that out. And when Jesus said this right here, was when they brought a woman to him and said, we found out that she committed adultery, and the law says to stone her. What do you want us to do? Right? They're trying to see if Jesus would lean on the Mosaic law there. And what he said to them was, well, you all can go ahead. If you don't have any sins, go ahead and cast the first stone. And each and every single one of them started to walk away. And by the time where it was just him and that woman, he said, well, did everybody leave? Well, if they're not going to condemn you, who am I to condemn? Right? And Jesus told her, go and sin no more. And so if Jesus had that level of kindness and forgiveness, right, and the ability to not judge, to refrain from the judgment, it really puts into perspective when we think that, we have the right to judge. And the reality is, when we're pointing a finger at somebody, there's 3 other fingers pointing back at us. And so this, in the other thing I want to point out that the spirits call out here as well, is they say that there's when it comes to forgiveness, right, and the good in general, there's more than a moral effect. There's also the physical effect, because we know that death does not free us from our enemies. And they go on still to say, again, right, making sure that we realize that we too are souls, we too are spirits that are working towards perfection. And because we're not there yet, there are still many things that we're working through. And so the spirits add that they'll let him who is without sin cast the first stone. They add, this maxim makes indulgence a duty. And indulgence here is a little bit different than the term that we're normally used to hearing when we think of indulgence, but think of this as tolerance or kindness. And so they go on to say, for there is no one who does not need indulgence or tolerance, patience in return. Indulgence teaches us that we must not judge others more severely than we would judge ourselves, or condemn others for what we absolve ourselves in. Before blaming someone else's wrong, let us see if that same reproof might not fall upon us. And so this, I think, as it relates to forgiveness, right, this kind of brings us to thinking about extending that kindness when something happens and it does hurt us. You know, being able to put ourselves in that person's shoes. It's easy for us at times to say, well, I would never do X, Y, and Z. But the reality is, unless we were in that exact same situation, under the exact circumstances that that person was in, we truly don't know, right? So the ability to extend that grace, extend that kindness before we make that judgment, before we make that call, where oftentimes we don't have all the details. We don't have all the context. We have no idea what might have happened, and we're jumping to a conclusion. There's a story of a couple whose kitchen had a very large glass window that faced the front of their neighbor. And for weeks, the wife would wash dishes in the morning as the neighbor's kids were getting ready to leave for school. And every single day, she complained about the fact that the kids' clothes were dirty. And she'd call her husband every single day and just upset say, I just can't believe, do you see how that mom lets the kids leave the house? All 3 kids, the clothes are dirty, they're wrinkled. I mean, how can they? And this went on for weeks and weeks at a time, until finally one day, she calls the husband and she goes, come here, I need you to see something. And he goes, what? And she says, do you see? The kids finally have clean clothes. And the husband goes, oh, I meant to tell you, I was out there yesterday. You pointed out that the kids had dirty clothes. I was watering the garden and they actually didn't have it. So then I came back inside, I saw what you pointed out, and I was really confused. It turns out our windows were dirty. Very silly, right? Very small, but context, the judgment. How many times do we sometimes make assumptions or jump to conclusions because we don't have the full picture? Or sometimes the amount of time that we could invest in organizing our own lives could be spent instead of judging or looking at what the next person is doing. And then the other piece here, which this is kind of in the middle of the chapter, but I think it's the best way to summarize, right, the importance of us looking inward as opposed to judging everyone around us. And Jesus said, how is it that you see a speck in your brother's eye? And we could look at speck as being like an eyelash, something very small. But you don't see the plank in your own. right? The equivalent of a full piece of wood that would prevent us from seeing, period. Or how is it that you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, let me take that tiny little eyelash while you have a plank in yours? You hypocrites, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you'll be able to take the speck out of your brother's eye. So again, right, the calling for us to look inward, to see what are the things that I can be doing to better myself, to evolve, and then help those along the way, but help them in a way where there is no judgment, right? It comes from a place of genuinely wanting to help those around us. And when we think about forgiveness, right, when we commit an offense, how do we want people to treat us? How do we want them to treat us when we go ask for forgiveness? Do we want them to be understanding? Do we want them to be kind, patient with us? Do we want them to be tolerant? And if we do want all those things, do we extend that to people when the roles are reversed? That's what he's calling us to do there, right? Is to have that self-reflection, to be able to extend that same grace and that same kindness, and have that very sincere forgiveness, the one that does come from the heart. And so, as we talk a little bit about what it looks like, we covered a lot of what happens when we need to be the ones to extend that forgiveness and that grace and that mercy. But what happens when we are the ones that have to seek that forgiveness, right? And the first thing here is the reflection piece. Before I can even apologize or seek forgiveness, I need to be able to reflect on my actions. Right? I need to be able to understand, or at least try to place myself in that person's shoes to understand, why is it that they were so hurt? What were my intentions? Was I upset? Was I having a bad day? And that's why I've reacted a certain way, right? So that self-reflection, truly seeking to find out, why did I react in that certain way there? What did I do? How did I hurt that person? And then once I reflect, it's owning that mistake, right? It's taking ownership. It's, yes, understanding that we're imperfect beings, we're evolving, we're working to be better, but that does not relieve me of the pain or the suffering that I have caused that person. And I need to take ownership of that before I can go ahead and then seek that reconciliation, which again, right, may not be guaranteed, because I may have the most sincere apology. I may have the most genuine apology, but that person might not be ready to receive it. And if they aren't, that's okay. We have done our part. We have given that person the ability to share their feelings, share where they're coming from. And the big thing here is, when we do reach out for that apology, right, is we apologize for our actions and how it made that person feel, without questioning that person's feelings, right? And that's a big one, because I think at times we can be very quick to react and to say, well, no, but I didn't mean to hurt you. But that doesn't change the fact that that person was hurt. Or saying, I'm really sorry, but, oh boy. The moment we add the but, everything else that came before it doesn't really matter, right? So really having that genuine intent to understand and to apologize, but also know that when we are seeking that reconciliation, right, we can try that, but we also have to be able to respect if the other person is just not at a point where they're ready to do that, and that's okay. Now, when it comes to, so we've covered forgiving other people, seeking the forgiveness, but I think at times the hardest one is probably the self-forgiveness. Would you all agree? What do you think? What's the hardest? What's the hardest one, do you guys think? Why is that?
I'm my own worst critic.
Yep, for sure. We're our own worst critic at times, for sure. What else?
We keep reliving it.
We keep reliving it. Yep, that good old rumination, for sure. And when it comes to the self-forgiveness, right, am I able to forgive other people if I can't forgive myself? It's pretty hard, right? It's pretty hard. Because if what we're being called to do is to extend the greatness, the grace, the kindness, the mercy, the tolerance, the patience, it's very hard to be able to do that for other people if I can't even do it for myself, right? And that's why the self-forgiveness piece is really big. And the first piece is acceptance. Now, we don't say acceptance in the sense of, well, I did it, it's done, I agreed. We say acceptance in the sense that whatever it is that we did, we can't go back and change it, but we can make a conscious decision today to be different, to act differently, to be different towards others, right? Again, still taking that ownership, that responsibility, but using that to be able to move forward as opposed to the rumination. And the other really big thing too is kind of the difference between guilt and perspective as we walk through that journey. There's a researcher, Brene Brown. I really love her books. And she makes a very clear distinction between guilt and shame, where guilt is, I did a bad thing, but I am not a bad person, and that thing doesn't define me, right? And so guilt can be used to change our behavior, whereas shame puts us in that place where we just feel stuck, where we can't move ahead, where we continue to ruminate, we continue to be stuck, right? It doesn't lead to progress. But the guilt sometimes is what pushes us to say, oh, wow, I need to change my behavior. Oh, I need to reach out to that person. I reflected, I'm guilty on how I acted. I need to reach out and apologize, right? So the clear distinction there of we are inherently good individuals, but sometimes we make bad decisions. But that doesn't make us a bad person, right? So there's a clear distinction between the two there. And then the last piece is the compassion, which we talked about a little bit about that already, which is the compassion that we want to extend to other people. We need to extend that same compassion to us. Think about the amount of times where we may have been giving advice to other people, right? Usually the amount of patience and grace that we extend to those people. But how often do we speak to ourselves with that same level of kindness? Especially when we make mistakes, right? So it's important that we have that compassion with ourselves, right? That we understand that we are doing the best that we can. And yes, sometimes we're going to trip up, we're going to make mistakes. But at the end of the day, the only way that we move from those mistakes, the only way that we heal is through forgiveness. And then the last piece there, which is that the self-forgiveness really depends just on me. And what I mean by that is if we've reached out to someone, we've tried, seeking the forgiveness and they don't want to talk to us, we can still practice the self-forgiveness, right? We can still move to the stage where we try to get past that situation because, again, we have done everything within our control. And when we talk about the ability to heal, right, to grow from that situation, that doesn't depend on that person. We can do our part, but we can't force someone else to forgive and act. Does that make sense? Does that sound crazy? No? Cool. So if everything we've talked about so far has not been convincing enough, let's talk about some quick reasons. First off, starting with the scientific ones. There is a ton of research, but the ones you see here in particular came from studies in Harvard and the University of Berkeley in California, where studies were done to show that folks who forgave had an increase in hope. It reduced their anger, it enhanced their self-esteem, and it enhanced several different aspects of their physical health. Now, for folks who might still not be convinced and go, well, but if I just don't forgive, I won't gain all those things, but I'll be where I'm at, and that's fine. If only that were the case. Because the flip side of that study was they actually did a bunch of interviews, and that's how the entire study was done. But what they were actually able to find out is that for people that made a conscious decision to not forgive, made a conscious decision to continue to ruminate, to think about the vengeance and hold on to the feelings and always talk about the negative things that happened, those people had a higher rate of heart disease. They had higher rates of high blood pressure. They had a ton of different chronic diseases that were associated with that, which then developed ulcers, cancers, and many, many other things. Along with the scientific studies, there are many different researches in Spiritism that ties those things as well, right? But even if it's just from a pure selfish standpoint, there's benefit in forgiving. Because if we start to think about all the things that we have named so far, who's the person who's benefited the most when we forgive? We are, right? And yet we're still so reluctant to be able to forgive because oftentimes we put the forgiveness as giving an out to that person. But the reality is, once we do get to a point where we are evolved enough to be able to look at that person as being another sibling in Christ, as someone who's just as imperfect as us, we are going to forgive for that sake and for those reasons, right? But until then, there are all these other reasons that there's really benefit for us, right? There's something in it for us to be able to forgive. And then from an emotional perspective, it's freeing. When we forgive, we're letting go of that burden. When we choose to hold on to those negative feelings, we're pretty much prisoners in a cell in which we hold the key the entire time. We have the key. We can choose to unlock that door and walk right out, but we choose to sit in there, tied to that person. And we, in a way, by choice, we continue to allow that person to have power over our lives because we continue to relive what it is that they did, and those negative feelings come and they start to hit us, and then now all of a sudden we're going to work and we're upset because we were reminded of what that person did. We're having a conversation with a colleague and we quickly snap at them, right? We may not realize it, but those feelings will impact every single part of our lives. And so from an emotional perspective, when we do make the conscious decision to forgive, we are letting go of that burden. We are healing and we're choosing the peace. We are choosing to move on from that particular state. And sometimes we can't do that on our own, right? And so this is where things like therapy will be able to assist with working through those emotions, working through whatever it was that happened. But at the end of the day, when we forgive, we're taking back control of our lives. We're saying, I am not going to let that moment, that thing that happened, that person, continue to have that negative effect on me. I am choosing me. I am choosing to live a positive life and to heal. And then, of course, from our spiritual perspective, question 886 in the Spiritist book, Kardec asks the spirits, what is the true meaning of the word charity as Jesus understood it? And the answers the spirits gave was benevolence toward everyone, indulgence, again, toward the imperfection of others, and forgiveness for offenses. Very simple, right? At least how it got said. Very simple in how it got said. Certainly not easy to carry it out, but That's why we're here, right? That's why we're here. We're one step closer to being able to get to that point, because we're making the conscious effort to come here, to study, to talk about these things. So there will be a point where we do eventually get there, and it becomes very easy. But it's going to take that practice, right? And the other piece in that chapter 10, and this was by one of the spirits commenting on that part from Matthew, and they said, when Jesus recommends being reconciled as quickly as possible with one's adversary, it is not only with a view to mitigate discords in the course of one's current existence, but rather to keep them from continuing in future ones. So again, looking at it from the lens that life doesn't end here. Do we want to resolve what we can right here, right now? Or do we want to continue to carry that? I would say resolve too, right? I saw you raised your hand. Did you have a question?
I do.
Yeah.
So the word reconcile, does that mean that you have to forgive or also let the other person know that the person will be forgiven? Or it's just a personal thing and the other person doesn't need to know? So
That's a good question. That's a really good question, because I think that also plays into, well, what happens if that person doesn't know that I did a thing? Do I still forgive? Right? So the forgiveness here, right? And again, in a perfect world, both parties would be able to reconcile. Both parties ask for the forgiveness, give the forgiveness, everybody reconciles, and it's all roses and butterflies. But the reality is we're not there yet, right? So what we can do is we can do our part. We can seek the reconciliation. We can seek the true, genuine forgiveness from the heart. But if that person is not open to that, is not open to that reconciliation, we have done our part. And you know, the spirits and all of the understanding, because the other thing to take into account too, and they actually cover this in this chapter, is what happens when the person either you have to forgive or you're seeking forgiveness from is no longer here, right? What if that person has they've already passed away? What do we do, right? And so again, what the spirits kind of bring us is the fact that, to your point specifically, is it's an internal decision. It's something from us, within us, about us, as it relates to somebody else, yes, but it's a decision that we're making for us in choosing to forgive, in choosing to seek that forgiveness, right? Because at the end of the day, we only control our decision. We don't get to control how someone else will react, but we can absolutely do our part. Does that help there? Yeah, Richard.
One of the things you were talking about before, when you were talking about guilt and shame, one of the differences in that is the ego.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you think about the ego, that's typically the thing that really prevents us and gets us in the way of being able to either forgive or to seek the forgiveness, right? And so if we have the ability of putting that ego aside and looking at the situation from the standpoint of, this is another soul who's incarnated here on earth, who's just as imperfect as I am, who's learning the same way that I am, who is learning through the challenges, right? It starts to kind of shift some of that perspective there. And they go on to add here, the spirits say, woe to those who say, I'll never forgive. By what right will they beg forgiveness for their wrongs if they themselves do not forgive the wrong of others? When Jesus says to forgive others, not 7 times, but 70 times 7, he teaches us that mercy should have no limits. And so very clearly here, right, is the idea that we shouldn't be keeping track, we shouldn't be keeping score, we shouldn't be thinking about it from the perspective, well, back in March of 2017, so-and-so, no, we don't want to hold on to that, right? The whole idea of the 70 times 7 is, again, yes, we're working through those lessons, but we are putting out that grace. We are putting out that compassion and that tolerance.
Just to add to the obstacle, because I guess we're built that way, right? The fact that we, in a very primitive stage, we are built to self-preserve. And we are built to not be vulnerable, because once you put yourself vulnerable, you are in a very weak position. We're built there in that way to protect ourselves from it, and that's the part of the people that it's a big block to forgive.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that the vulnerability is a really big call out, right? Is when we are seeking that forgiveness, we are being very, very vulnerable. We're putting ourselves out there not knowing how that person is going to react. But we're willing to do it anyway because we know it's the right thing. And I think that there's also a component of assuming positive intent, right? Being able to provide that individual the ability to explain where they were coming from. Give them the ability to provide context. If we all pause here for just a quick moment and you think about someone who did something that hurt you, and what if that person was doing the best that they could do? Probably doesn't change, right? It doesn't change what happened, but it might change our perspective a little bit. No matter how bad that thing might have been, what if it was? What if Jesus came down and assured you that that was truly the best thing that that person knew how to do at that point in time? It makes it really hard to judge or to blame someone who is not perfect, but it's still trying to do the best that they can, right? And that's the reality of it. The majority of the time, that's what's happening. We're doing the best that we can. It may not be what we expect, but it's the absolute best that that person has to give. And then in this book, which we won't go through all of them, but in this book, they kind of give a fourfold path to forgiveness, or kind of ways to be able to exercise and work through that forgiveness, in terms of the first thing being, you've got to acknowledge the pain, right? Otherwise it kind of stays hidden down there and it'll resurface at times. But if we don't take a moment to actually reflect and acknowledge what that was, to be able to talk about it, it makes it a lot more difficult to be able to work through those. And then being able to understand how that affected us, what were the consequences that came from that, and then being able to go through and choose to let go, even if we're not at a point where we can forget the situation, right? We want to have that, the lesson, whatever it is that we're taking from that. And then kind of the last piece there is being renewing or releasing the relationship, right? Which is what we talked about earlier. In a perfect scenario, it works out, we can renew that relationship, we can both grow from it, but there may be situations where we do end up releasing the relationship there, where we forgive, but we understand that maybe there's not a way for us to reconcile.
When you have all the good intention to do all these steps and you want really to forgive, how can we get help with the rumination? Because that is involuntary. Yeah. So I try to do it, all the steps, I forgive, and the rumination is something that I don't want it to learn no more. How to get help from that? Yeah,
that's a good question. A few different ways. I would say therapy teaches some ways to be able to go through and not essentially train yourself to go, oh, I'm doing the thing, let me catch myself. Honestly, the buddy system sometimes. Having someone in your close circle that whenever, they catch you doing it, hey, you're bringing that thing back up again, right? Like having someone that kind of helps you, kind of hold you accountable to it. Because to your point, sometimes we don't realize we're doing it, right? What did you say, Richard? I'm sorry. have somebody that can, because to your point, right, we're not aware that we're doing it. Sometimes it's so deep and so ingrained that we don't even think about it and we're doing it. So having somebody that can go, hey, you're doing the thing, and then the other piece is prayer. If I had to bring it down to just one thing to do it, right, is the prayer. And the reason why I say that is the ability to overcome that rumination takes practice. And if every single day we're making it a point to pray about that thing, to ask for guidance, to ask for healing, to ask that we don't ruminate anymore, right? Eventually we're going to get into that process. And sometimes I will say, sometimes I go as far as putting a sticky note that I look at every single day, because again, that reminder, right? That repetition of being able to get into that habit of going, oh yeah, I don't want to think about that. And then naturally we get to a point where we generally don't think about it because we don't give that thing the same value that we once did back then. Mm-hmm.
If I'm not mistaken, that Desmond Tutu, the South African I heard about this book and I read it, but he writes with so much authority because of the process in which they went through. They didn't necessarily revert apartheid immediately, but it was a process of forgiveness that they were able to reconstruct the country, and not the country per se, but the population and the, coming back from the hate and moving on as a community.
Yep, and I'll add too, if you all like audiobooks, the audiobook is actually narrated by him and his daughter, who are both of the authors of the book. Yeah. So yeah, super quick. We're almost to the end here. The big call out is when something happens, when there's an offense, there's a choice that we're making, right? And we can either go directly, have that pain turn into that rumination, that over and over and that vicious cycle, which then we get there because we struggle to put ourselves in the place of that individual, right? We tend to gravitate towards the blame, the arrogance. And so with that, we start to think of revenge, the vengeance, right? Well, how can I get back at that person? And naturally, that brings us just more pain. And now we're stuck in that vicious cycle. And so the conscious decision here, right, is when there is that offense and there is pain, we can make a conscious decision to say, okay, let me take a pause here. Let me reflect on what happened. Let me assume positive intent. Let me provide that person with the ability of talking to me, explaining, asking questions. What happened? Why did you act this way? What caused us to be in this place? After that reflection, right, I can extend out that grace, the patience, the tolerance, the reminding that, hey, we're all imperfect, we're in this together, we're working through things, we're trying to evolve together. After that, I can choose the forgiveness. And then at that point, I do have the ability of making the choice of either repairing the relationship or freeing the relationship, right? Again, if both parties decide that we want to continue on that relationship, wonderful. If not, we can still forgive without having to reconcile or to, continue on with that relationship. And we can both go our separate ways while still wishing genuinely that person well and wishing all of the best things to come to them. And so last but not least, this was a message received by the medium Chico Xavier in the book, The Counselor. And it says, forgiving evil is to annihilate evil itself. And forgiving those who do it is teaching love, winning sincere and precious affections. Hence the need for forgiveness in the world, so that the fire of evil can be exterminated, returning legitimate peace to hearts. So I hope that you all will consider reading chapter 10 of the Gospel According to Spiritism. It's a super, super short read, 20 minutes or so. It covers all of the stuff that we talked about on here. But ultimately, I hope that we can reflect on the fact that when we do choose forgiveness, we are the biggest beneficiaries of it. We are the ones that are allowing ourselves to heal. We're saying we're not responsible. We can't change the things that have happened, but we can choose how we heal from that. We can choose to be able to move forward and to be free as a bird. So thank you. I appreciate you all.